Hi, my name is Saul, and this is the next episode in the series that I'm doing as part of the 2026 Winter Catalyst program with Wispace. In this part of the series, I'm going to be talking about MVP, and I'll link down the episodes to the other part of the series below. So let's get right into it. We're going to talk about building an MVP. And when you start any idea, the very important fundamental question to ask is this even a good idea to be building? And without actually wasting a lot of time building this thing, you want to start with actually testing it. And that's what an MVP is really for. MVP stands for minimal viable product, but another way to think about it is a minimal valuable product. Because really an MVP it's the smallest thing that creates values for users. So analogy is you want to think of it as like something that gets the user that you're looking to get to from point A to point B. So one of the good examples that I can think of, for instance, is that let's say the person wants to get from one place to another, and your MVP might be a bike, but the ultimate product that you want to build is a motorcycle. So as you can see, there's obviously some similarities and there's major differences between one and the other. But the idea is that would the user use a bike to get from point A to point B? And if they do, very much likely then they can also consider using a motorcycle, and you can kind of build from there. A bike can be a great MVP for a final product that might be a motorcycle, because the idea behind a bike is that it gets the person from one place to another. So that's one way to be thinking about it. Another thing is that when you're actually testing, you want to see if people actually use it. So the core mindset is don't build kind of everything around the MVP. You don't want to be spending a lot of time really making it perfect. So don't aim for perfection. What you're trying to do is you're trying to test certain assumptions. And your focus should be about testing as little assumptions as possible in this stage of your experimentation. So say this kind of clearly. Your MVP is not your final product. It is an experiment. So how do we start building an MVP? Well, the first place to start is to map the user's journey at a high level. So this can start with something like acquisition. So how do they find you? Onboarding, how do you get them started? Setup and configuration. What sort of things that have to happen in order for them to actually be able to use the product? And things like doing some tasks. Typically, a lot of users will have to do certain tasks in the beginning in order to get some value for themselves. So for instance, in the case of ChatGPT, you have to put in a prompt in order to get an output out of it that you're looking for. So that's sort of the task. And then obviously there's the point of getting value. So how does that look like? What kind of value do they get? And then there's things like after use feedback. How are you collecting feedback afterwards so you can make sure that you're providing the kind of value you want? So when you're focusing on developing MVP, the focus should be on the problem. It shouldn't be on the solution. You want to keep it simple and you want to focus on the happy paths only. You don't want to focus on edge cases. You don't want to focus on sort of things that might go wrong in this portion of it. The reason being is that you're really just trying to test some assumptions. When you get to a point where you know that this is going to work, then you start to focus on those things. So that's one of the important things that we learned. The next step is to identify users. And that can be quite challenging in the beginning. So when you're thinking about identifying users, you don't want to just focus on the user that would be directly using the product. There might be other auxiliary users that might be supporting them. So for instance, you might ask, who has this problem? And that might be quite clear. But then you can also ask, who helps them use it? Who pays for it, right? These are other types of questions that might go into play that you may need to consider when you're developing your MVP. So the important insight here is the helpers and the support are also users. And so when you are moving to the next stage, which I'll talk about, is you want to consider them because you're going to be creating what's called personas. And personas can be quite challenging because you're considering multiple people. But again, the idea is to keep it simple. So even though you might create different personas, you really want to just pick one. And the persona that you really want to focus on is the one that's actually doing the payment, because that's the person who really sees value in exchange for dollar, and that's the one that you really want to focus on in the beginning. So building MVP, it's really about building for that one person, that decision maker who's going to say, yes, this is something that is worth it, or this is not something that is going to work. And it's usually going to be the person who is going to be signing the check. So your MVP should deliver one main value. Everything should support that value. The rest of the stuff is just going to be fat that you want to cut. So the next step is to reduce time to value. That's a very important part of delivering value, because if it takes too long for the user to receive value, that might be a deal breaker for them. So the question is, how fast can users get value? And the faster they can get it, the better. So the questions you want to ask in this situation is, what slows them down when they're trying to reach value? What can I remove that might be in their way? So after that, the next thing you want to do is break everything down into components. The reason you want to break things into components, because then you can apply first principles in order to put them together in a way that's going to really bring value at the kind of cost that you want. So these pieces can include things like, how are users managed when you bring them into the platform? Is there going to be payments? Is there messaging? All these little components that goes into developing the product, you really want to make sure you look at them from an individual component basis and determine what needs to be in there and what doesn't. Because at the end of the day, you don't have to include everything at that moment when you're trying to build the MVP. So some of those components would be things that you want to build. Some of them might be things you want to buy. And some of them are things that you're going to just do manually, because you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time building everything, or even spending a lot of money building it, if you can just do it manually. An example would be like a database. Maybe you can use a Google Sheet in order to replace something on database, and then later down the road, use an actual database. But when you're trying to test and see if the user would be interested, you really want to just stay as lean as possible. So manual is definitely okay for an MVP. The next step is to cut the scope aggressively. The reason, again, you broke it down to components is that you can put them back together using first principles. And the idea behind first principles is also to cut things that don't necessarily need to be there. So you want to ask the questions like, do I really need this right now for this particular assumption test? And if it doesn't, just get rid of it, because you want to stay as lean as possible. So the full system absolutely might have it. But for the basic version, the sort of the bicycle that I talked about earlier, you want to stay as lean as possible, because the direction is to build for testing. So now that you got everything in place, how do we actually build this? So there's a lot of options to do that. One of them is just build a wireframe, which then demonstrates the idea. The other way is to actually build a prototype. And there's many different types of ways to do that. You can use no-code tools. You can even use vibe coding. One of the key things you want to focus on for an MVP is to simulate the experience. You don't necessarily want to focus on the colors and the aesthetics, because that might actually confuse people. There's been situations where a user would say, I don't like it because I don't like the layout, or I don't like the color of this particular thing. And you don't want them to focus on those things. You really want to just deliver the value and for them to see what it's like. The next thing is to measure success. So in this moment, you want to ask questions like, are users getting value? Are they coming back? Do they even care about this product? So in the end, the principles you want to follow are basically this: solve a real problem. We're going to make sure that the MVP is good enough. You don't need to focus on perfect. So good enough is much better than perfect. Be fast and flexible, and talk to users constantly. Remember, the MVP is a learning tool, definitely not a scaling tool.